The bride who feared to step down, a woman paralyzed by terror, a stagecoach door that might as well be the gates of hell, and a stranger whose patience would change everything. This is the story of Lillian Moore, who traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, only to freeze at the final moment. What happened next would test whether courage is born from fearlessness or from taking one impossible step. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach wheels screamed against the Colorado dust like the cry of something dying. Inside the cramped cabin, Lillian Moore pressed herself against the worn leather seat, her gloved fingers white-knuckled around the handle of her carpet bag, as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had begun to tilt dangerously sideways. Through the small window, she could see it. Dust Valley. The town her future husband had described in his careful, measured letters. The place where her new life was supposed to begin. Except Lillian couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could barely remember why she'd thought this was a good idea in the first place. Dust Valley! Last stop! The driver's voice boomed from above, followed by the groaning complaint of the brake lever. The coach lurched once, twice, then settled into an uneasy stillness that somehow felt more terrifying than the motion had been. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. Through the dust-hazed window, she could make out shapes, buildings, people, the raw bones of civilization scratched into the wilderness. And somewhere out there, Samuel Reed, the rancher, the man who'd written to her with such quiet dignity about needing a wife, about building something good in this hard country. The man whose photograph showed serious eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. The man she'd agreed to marry without ever hearing his voice. What have I done? The thought wasn't new. It had accompanied her on every mile of the journey west from Boston, gaining volume and urgency with each passing day. On the train, it had whispered. On the connecting coach through Kansas, it had spoken clearly. Now, here in the suffocating heat of this wooden box, it screamed. Ma'am? The driver's weathered face appeared at the window, eyebrows raised. This is your stop. Mr. Reed's waiting. Lillian's mouth opened but produced no sound. Her body had staged a rebellion, every muscle locked in mutiny against her brain's increasingly frantic commands to move, stand, exit, face what came next. Ma'am? The driver's expression shifted from mild confusion to concern. You all right in there? She wasn't. She was the opposite of all right. She was a 32-year-old woman who'd fled Boston with nothing but a carpetbag in desperation, who'd gambled everything on letters from a stranger, who'd convinced herself that marrying for practical reasons made more sense than the alternative. Which was what? Staying in her brother-in-law's house, watching him drink away what little remained of her sister's memory, becoming a permanent burden, a pitied spinster, a cautionary tale. Lillian's voice came out strangled. I need a moment. The driver's weathered face softened with something that might have been pity. He'd probably seen this before. Mail-order brides who made it all the way to the threshold of their new lives before their courage failed. Take your time, ma'am. But he's out here. Been waiting since dawn, Mr. Reed has. That somehow made it worse. The knowledge that Samuel Reed had been standing in the sun for hours, waiting for a woman he'd never met, trusting in the promises made through ink and paper. What if she was nothing like he'd imagined? What if the woman who'd written those careful, somewhat dishonest letters, the woman who'd made herself sound braver, younger, more useful than she really was, what if that woman turned out to be a fiction? Through the window, Lillian caught a glimpse of movement. A man's silhouette, tall and broad-shouldered, standing very still in the pale morning light. Watching the coach. Waiting. Her stomach clenched. Miss Moore? Another voice now, deep and surprisingly gentle, coming from outside the coach door, not the driver. Him. Samuel Reed speaking her name for the first time, his accent carrying the soft edges of somewhere south. Miss Moore, I'm Samuel. We've been writing. Such a simple statement, such an extraordinary understatement. They'd been writing for 6 months, his letters arriving at her sister's house in Boston with clockwork regularity. Letters that started formal and gradually grew warmer, revealing a man who worked hard, read books, thought about things beyond just survival. A man who admitted to loneliness without wallowing in it, who asked about her opinions, remembered details, made her feel, for perhaps the first time in her life, genuinely seen. "I know this must be frightening," Samuel continued, his voice steady and unhurried. "Coming all this way to meet a stranger. I've been thinking about it myself, wondering if you'd take one look at me and regret every mile." Despite her panic, something in Lillian's chest loosened slightly. He was nervous too. She wasn't the only one terrified by what they'd set in motion. "The thing is," Samuel went on, and she could hear him shifting his weight, could almost picture him turning his hat in his hands the way men did when they didn't know what to do with the excess energy of their discomfort. "I made you a promise. In my letters. I promised you'd be safe here, that I'd give you time, that I wouldn't rush you into anything you weren't ready for. And I mean to keep that promise, Miss Moore. So you take all the time you need in there. I'll wait." The driver made a small sound, surprise or approval, Lillian couldn't tell. She pressed her palm against the window, the glass warm beneath her glove. Through the wavy panes, she could see him more clearly now. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with gray at the temples. His profile showed a strong jaw, a straight nose, lines around his eyes that suggested time spent squinting into sun and wind. He wasn't young, probably close to her own age, but he stood with the solid patience of a man who'd learned that some things couldn't be rushed. A rancher. A man who understood seasons, who planted things and waited for them to grow. "Mr. Reed," Lillian managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm being foolish." "No, ma'am." He turned toward the coach then, and she saw his face fully for the first time. The photograph hadn't lied, but it hadn't captured the quiet kindness in his expression either. "You're being human. Nothing foolish about that." Lillian's hands trembled as she smoothed down her traveling dress, gray wool, practical, already dusty from the journey. She'd worn her best clothes the first 2 days, then realized the absurdity of trying to stay presentable while crossing half a continent. Now she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd been traveling for 2 weeks straight, sleeping in questionable hotels and eating questionable food, wondering with each passing mile if she was running toward something or just away from everything. She stopped, started again. "I don't know if I can do this." Samuel Reed was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried no judgment, no frustration, just a simple acknowledgement of truth. "You already did the hard part, Miss Moore. You got on that first train in Boston. You traveled 2,000 miles to a place you'd never seen. You came all this way on nothing but words and faith." He paused. "The rest of it? We'll figure that out together, one step at a time." One step at a time, such a small thing, such an impossibly large thing. The coach door opened. The driver had climbed down and pulled the handle, flooding the dim interior with bright Colorado sunshine. The light hurt Lillian's eyes after hours in the shadows, but she didn't look away. Couldn't, because Samuel Reed had moved closer, into her line of sight, and he was holding out his hand. Not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. His hand was large, weathered, scarred along the knuckles from work she could only imagine. A rancher's hand. A hand that had built things, fixed things, coaxed life from difficult soil. The nails were clean but permanently stained, the calluses visible even from where she sat frozen inside the coach. "You don't have to decide everything now," Samuel said softly, his eyes, brown, she noticed, deep brown with flecks of gold, meeting hers with startling directness. "You don't have to know if you'll marry me, or if you'll stay, or anything else. You just need to take this one step. Come out of the coach. Let me take you somewhere you can rest. Then we'll talk. Just talk. That's all." Lillian stared at his hand, at the possibility it represented, at the terror and the hope, and the desperate, aching need she had to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this, that she could be brave enough to choose something instead of just running away. Behind Samuel, Dust Valley spread out in the morning light. It wasn't much, a main street lined with wooden buildings, some painted, most not. A general store, a saloon, what looked like a church steeple in the distance. Mountains rose in the background, purple and imposing, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. It was raw and rough, and so far from Boston it might as well have been another planet. But Samuel Reed's hand remained steady, patient, waiting. Lillian Moore took a breath that felt like it might tear her apart. Then she reached out, her gloved hand trembling so badly she almost couldn't make the connection. When her fingers touched his palm, she felt the warmth through the thin cotton, felt the steadiness of his grip as he closed his hand gently around hers. "That's it," he murmured. "Just like that. Now the next step." She stood on shaking legs, her muscles cramped from hours of sitting, from days of tension. The coach doorway seemed impossibly high, the ground impossibly far. But Samuel was there, his hand firm around hers, his other hand reaching to steady her elbow as she ducked through the opening. "I've got you," he said. "Take your time." The step down from the coach felt like stepping off the edge of the world. For a moment, one crystalline, terrifying moment, Lillian was suspended between old life and new, between who she'd been and who she might become. Then her boot touched Colorado dirt, and the ground held steady beneath her. She'd made it. She was here. Samuel Reed released her elbow but kept hold of her hand, steadying her as she found her balance. Up close, he was taller than she'd expected, his shoulders broader, his presence more substantial. He smelled of soap and leather and something else, sage maybe, or the clean scent of open land. "Welcome to Dust Valley, Miss Moore," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile but was warmer than the serious expression from his photograph. "I know it's not much to look at, but it's home." Lillian tried to respond, but her throat had closed around whatever word she might have formed. She was aware of people watching, the driver securing luggage on top of the coach, a few townspeople pausing in their business to observe the arrival of Samuel Reed's mail-order bride. The attention made her skin prickle with self-consciousness. Samuel must have noticed her discomfort because he positioned himself slightly between her and the curious onlookers, creating a small buffer of privacy with his body. "Your trunk's up top?" he asked. She nodded, still not trusting her voice. "I'll get it loaded onto my wagon. Mrs. Harper runs a boarding house just up the street. I thought you might want to stay there for a bit. Get settled, rest from your journey. She's a good woman, fair rates, and her cooking's about the best in town." He was still holding her hand, she realized, still anchoring her to this moment, this place, this decision. "That sound all right to you?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. All her fears during the journey, that he'd be rough, demanding, that he'd expect immediate marriage and immediate everything else. None of it matched the gentle concern of the man standing before her. He was offering her space, time, respect. "Yes," Lillian managed, the word coming out scratchy. "Thank you. That sounds—" "Yes." Samuel nodded, seemingly satisfied, and finally released her hand. The absence of his touch felt like a small loss, which startled her. "Wait here just a moment. Let me settle with the driver." He moved away, his gait easy and confident, to where the driver was wrestling her trunk from the top of the coach. Lillian watched him help with the heavy luggage, all her worldly possessions compressed into one beaten leather trunk, and tried to organize her scattered thoughts into something resembling coherence. This was Samuel Reed, her correspondent, the man whose letters had become the brightest points in her weeks, whose careful descriptions of ranch life and philosophical musings about building something good in hard country had given her the courage to leave Boston. He was real, solid, here, and she'd nearly stayed in that coach. "Miss Moore?" Lillian turned to find a woman approaching, older, perhaps 60, wearing a practical calico dress and an expression of warm curiosity. Her hair was steel gray, pulled back in a sensible bun, and her face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in this climate. "I'm Dorothy Harper," the woman said, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone used to managing things. "I run the boarding house. Samuel asked me to come meet you, make sure you had a friendly face in all this newness." "Oh," Lillian felt herself flush. "That's very kind." Mrs. Harper's eyes were sharp but not unkind as they assessed Lillian from dusty boots to travel-worn hat. "You look done in, dear. That's a hard journey you've made. Come on up to my place. I'll get you settled with a room and a hot meal. Samuel can bring your things." It was decided with such matter-of-fact kindness that Lillian found herself following Mrs. Harper down the main street before she'd consciously agreed. Behind them, she could hear Samuel and the driver discussing the logistics of the trunk, their voices fading as the two women walked. Dust Valley revealed itself in pieces as they moved through it. The street was wide and dusty, lined with wooden boardwalks that provided raised paths between buildings. The general store's window displayed everything from dry goods to what looked like mining equipment. The saloon, the Silver Spur, according to its hand-painted sign, was quiet at this morning hour, though Lillian could hear piano music drifting from inside. A few men in work clothes tipped their hats as they passed, their curiosity obvious but mostly polite. "Don't mind the gawking," Mrs. Harper said without looking back. "We don't get many new people here, especially not respectable ladies. You'll be a 7-day wonder, but they'll settle down once the novelty wears off." "I suppose everyone knows why I'm here," Lillian said quietly. "That you're Samuel Reed's intended?" "Yes, dear. Not much stays secret in a town this size." Mrs. Harper glanced back, her expression softening. "But don't worry yourself over it. Samuel's well liked around here, respected. If he chose you, folks will give you a fair chance." If he chose you. The words hung in the air, as if Samuel were the only one making a choice, as if Lillian's agreement was already assumed. But maybe that's how it looked from the outside, a desperate spinster from back east, grateful for any offer of marriage, any escape from poverty or disgrace. The thought stung more than it should have. The boarding house was a 2-story structure painted a faded yellow, with a wide front porch and lace curtains in every window. Flower boxes beneath those windows held struggling geraniums, their red blooms brave against the harsh sunlight. A sign by the door read, "Harper House, rooms and meals, respectable clientele only." "Here we are," Mrs. Harper announced, climbing the porch steps with the ease of long practice. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and quiet. I've got 3 other boarders right now, the school teacher, Miss Peters, Mr. Cho, who does tailoring, and old Mr. Brennan, who's retired from mining. They keep to themselves mostly, won't bother you none." Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and something baking, bread maybe, or cake. The front hall was narrow but immaculately kept, with a wooden staircase leading to the second floor and doorways opening to what looked like a parlor and dining room. Everything was worn but cared for, the kind of place that might not have much money but had plenty of pride. "Your room's upstairs," Mrs. Harper said, already climbing. "Second door on the right. I'll bring up some fresh water for washing once you're settled." The room was small, just large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, a bureau, and a single chair by the window. But it was spotlessly clean, with crisp white linens on the bed and cheerful yellow curtains that matched the house's exterior paint. The window looked out over the main street, offering a view of the mountains in the distance. "Meals are served at 7, noon, and 6, Mrs." Harper was saying, moving around the room with efficient movements, checking that the water pitcher was full, that the chamber pot was clean. "If you need something outside those times, you let me know. I'll do laundry on Tuesdays if you need it. Rooms 50 cents a day, meals included." Lillian set down her carpet bag, her arms trembling with more than just the weight of it. 50 cents a day. She had enough money for perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3 if she was very careful. She'd have to make a decision before then, marry Samuel Reed or what? Find work? In a town this small, what work would there be for a woman with no useful skills beyond managing a household and keeping accounts? "Samuel's a good man," Mrs. Harper said suddenly, her tone gentler now. She'd stopped her bustling and stood by the door, regarding Lillian with something like sympathy. "I know you don't know him yet, can't know if what I'm saying is true, but I've lived in this valley for 23 years, and I've never known Samuel Reed to be anything but honest and decent. His parents were the same way before they passed, good people." "When did he lose them?" Lillian heard herself ask. 5 years ago now. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Nearly destroyed him, from what I hear. He was their only child, and they were close. Mrs. Harper's expression grew thoughtful. "That's when he got quiet, I think. Stopped coming to town socials, stopped courting. There was a girl before, but it didn't work out. Threw himself into the ranch instead. Did well enough at it, too. That land of his is prime grazing country." Lillian absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the man who'd just held out his hand to her with such patient kindness. A man who'd lost his parents, his isolation, who'd gotten lonely enough to write to a marriage broker in Boston seeking a wife, just like she'd gotten desperate enough to answer. "I'll leave you to rest," Mrs. Harper said, moving toward the door. "Samuel will bring your trunk up when he arrives. Take your time settling in. Lord knows you've earned it after that journey." When the door closed, Lillian sank onto the bed, her legs finally giving out. The mattress was thin but comfortable, the pillow beneath her hand stuffed with something that smelled faintly of lavender. Through the window, she could see a slice of Dust Valley's main street, see the mountains beyond, see the vast sweep of sky that seemed so much bigger here than it ever had in Boston. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Gotten off the coach, taken Samuel's hand, made it to this room that was the first space that had belonged to her, really belonged to her, in years. But the hard part was still coming. The conversation that waited. The decision about whether these letters, these promises, these hopes were enough to build a marriage on. "One step at a time," Samuel had said. Lillian pulled off her gloves and stared at her bare hands, pale, soft, useless hands that had never done real work. City hands, lady hands, hands that would need to learn how to be useful on a ranch if she went through with this. If. The word felt both terrifying and necessary. A knock came at the door. "Miss Moore, it's Samuel. I've got your trunk." Lillian stood, smoothed her skirt, and opened the door. Samuel Reed stood in the narrow hallway, her battered trunk hoisted on one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. Up close, in the dimmer light of the hallway, she could see more details. A small scar through his left eyebrow, the strong column of his throat, the way his shirt pulled across shoulders built from physical labor. "Where would you like it?" he asked. "By the bureau, I think." "Thank you." He moved past her into the small room, and the space seemed to shrink with his presence in it. He set the trunk down carefully, then straightened, looking around with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's a good room," he said finally. "Mrs. Harper keeps a fine establishment." "Yes, she seems very kind." An awkward silence fell between them, made more pronounced by the intimacy of the space. Her room, her bed just a few feet away. The two of them alone together for the first time. Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks and hated herself for it. Samuel cleared his throat. "I thought if you're up to it after you've rested some, we might talk. This afternoon, maybe. Nothing formal, just talk. About expectations and such. About what we're both hoping for here." He met her eyes, and she saw uncertainty in his gaze that matched her own. "Because I'm guessing you've got questions, and I know I do." "Yes," Lillian managed. "That would be... yes. Good. The hotel has a dining room, more public than here, more proper. We could meet there around 4? That give you enough time to rest?" She nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness, for the way he was maintaining propriety even though they were supposed to be engaged. 4 o'clock. I'll be there." Samuel nodded, seeming relieved to have a plan. "Right then. I'll let you get settled." He moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the frame. "Miss Moore, I just want to say, I'm glad you came. Glad you were brave enough to step off that coach. I know it wasn't easy." Before Lillian could respond, he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs, the front door opening and closing as he left the boarding house. She sank back onto the bed, her heart racing. In a few hours, she'd sit down with Samuel Reed, and they'd have the conversation that would determine the rest of her life. They'd talk about marriage and ranching and all the practical details that turn strangers into husband and wife. But right now, in this moment, all she could think about was the warmth of his hand around hers, the steadiness of his voice, the way he'd waited patiently while she found her courage. One step at a time. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was how you built a life. Not in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in small acts of trust, in hands held out and hands that reached back. Lillian pulled her trunk closer and opened it, the familiar smell of her old life rising from the carefully packed contents. Everything she owned, everything she was, compressed into this one container. She'd have to unpack it now, put her things in the bureau drawers, hang her dresses in the narrow wardrobe. She'd have to make this room her home, at least for now. Through the window, the Colorado sun blazed down on Dust Valley, and somewhere out there was a ranch where Samuel Reed had scrubbed floors and hung curtains, preparing a home for a woman he'd never met. A woman who was, perhaps, preparing herself to become someone new. Lillian stood before the small mirror above the washstand, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her gray traveling dress. 4 o'clock approached with the inevitability of a storm, and she felt no more prepared for this conversation than she had for stepping off that stagecoach. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized, pale, exhausted, her dark hair escaping its pins in ways that would have horrified her sister back in Boston. Boston. The very thought of it seemed to belong to another lifetime now. She'd managed to sleep for an hour after Samuel left, a fitful rest punctuated by dreams of endless prairies and faceless strangers. When she woke, the sun had shifted across the floor of her small room, and Mrs. Harper had left a pitcher of fresh water and a plate of sandwiches outside her door. The kindness of that gesture had nearly brought tears to Lillian's eyes. Such a simple thing, but it spoke of thoughtfulness, of care, of a community that might possibly welcome her. Now, with 20 minutes until she was supposed to meet Samuel, Lillian wrestled with her appearance and her anxiety in equal measure. She'd changed into her better dress, still gray, still practical, but at least clean and less wrinkled. She'd managed to pin her hair into something approaching respectability, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and her stomach churned with a nervousness that made her regret eating those sandwiches. What would they talk about? What did two strangers discuss when deciding whether to bind their lives together? In her correspondence with Samuel, they'd written about books and weather, about his ranch and her life in Boston, carefully edited versions of truth, pleasant letters that revealed enough to seem honest while hiding anything too painful or complicated. But sitting across from each other, looking into each other's eyes, could they maintain those careful fictions? Did she even want to? A knock on her door made her jump. "Miss Moore? It's Dorothy Harper. Just checking if you need anything before you meet Samuel." Lillian opened the door to find the older woman holding a shawl of soft blue wool. "Evenings get cool here, even in summer," Mrs. Harper said, offering the garment. "You'll want this. And don't look so terrified, dear. Samuel Reed's not going to eat you." "I'm not terrified," Lillian protested weakly. Mrs. Harper's expression suggested she wasn't fooled. "You're about to have a conversation that will determine your whole future. Of course you're terrified, but here's what I'll tell you. Samuel's as nervous as you are, probably more. He's been pacing outside the hotel for the past half hour like a condemned man." The image of Samuel Reed, so solid and steady this morning, pacing nervously, should have been amusing. Instead, it made something in Lillian's chest soften. He was human too, uncertain too. Not just the capable rancher who'd calmly talked her off that stagecoach, but a man who was taking just as much of a risk as she was. "Thank you," Lillian said, accepting the shawl, "for the kindness, for everything." Mrs. Harper patted her arm. "We women have to look out for each other, especially out here. Now go on. Don't keep him waiting any longer or he'll wear a path in the boardwalk." The hotel was only a few buildings down from the boarding house, but the walk felt impossibly long. Lillian was aware of eyes following her, townspeople watching from windows and doorways, curious about Samuel Reed's mail-order bride. She kept her gaze forward, her chin up, channeling every lesson in deportment her mother had drilled into her years ago. If nothing else, she could face this with dignity. Samuel was indeed on the boardwalk outside the hotel, and Mrs. Harper hadn't exaggerated about the pacing. He wore clean clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, a vest that looked like it had been carefully brushed. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd recently washed, and he'd shaved, the angles of his jaw now cleanly defined. When he saw her approaching, he stopped mid-stride, and his expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for her to read. "Miss Moore," he said, removing his hat, "you look... That is, I hope you were able to rest some." "I did, thank you." Up close, she could see that his collar was slightly crooked, that his hands were clenched tight around his hat brim. He was nervous. The realization steadied her somehow. If they were both frightened, at least they were frightened together. "Shall we?" Samuel gestured toward the hotel's entrance. "I asked them to set up a table by the window. More public that way. Didn't want you to feel... I thought it would be more proper." That's very thoughtful. The hotel dining room was modest but clean, with perhaps a dozen tables covered in checkered cloths. At this afternoon hour, only a few were occupied. A couple of men in business suits hunched over coffee, an elderly woman working on needlepoint near the fireplace. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacular mustaches, greeted Samuel with obvious familiarity and led them to a table by the front window, just as Samuel had requested. Lillian sat, arranging her skirts, hyper-aware of Samuel taking the chair across from her. The table was small enough that their knees almost touched underneath it. The window beside them offered a view of the main street, of the mountains beyond, of this whole strange new world she'd entered. "Coffee?" the proprietor asked. "We've got some cake too, if you're interested. My wife made it fresh this morning." "Coffee for me," Samuel said, then looked at Lillian. "Miss Moore?" "Tea, if you have it. And yes, cake would be lovely." When the proprietor departed, silence fell between them. Not quite comfortable, not quite awkward, but weighted with all the things they needed to say and didn't know how to begin. Samuel's fingers drummed once on the table, then stilled as if he'd consciously stopped himself. Lillian folded her hands in her lap, then unfolded them, then folded them again. "This is strange," Samuel said finally, and there was something almost rueful in his voice. "I've been thinking about what to say for weeks now, planning it out. And now that you're sitting here, every word I'd prepared has just gone." Despite her nerves, Lillian felt her mouth curve slightly. "I know what you mean. I practiced speeches on the entire train ride. Very eloquent speeches. Can't remember a single one now." Samuel's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Maybe that's better. Maybe we should just talk, like we did in the letters, but out loud." "All right." Lillian took a breath. "Then I'll start with the truth. I'm terrified, Mr. Reed. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and I'm not sure that's a good enough reason to marry someone." She hadn't meant to be quite that honest, quite that quickly, but once the words started, they kept coming. "My sister died 2 years ago. Consumption. She was married to a man who loved his whiskey more than he loved her, and after she passed, I stayed to keep house for him because I had no other options. No money, no prospects, no skills that anyone would pay for. When he started looking at me the way a brother-in-law shouldn't," she stopped, swallowed hard. "That's when I answered the marriage broker's advertisement. Not because I was looking for love or adventure, but because I was desperate." The proprietor arrived with their coffee and tea, along with 2 generous slices of spice cake. He seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation because he set everything down quickly and retreated without his earlier chattiness. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his coffee steaming untouched before him. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Thank you for that honesty. That took courage." He picked up his cup, then set it down again without drinking. "My turn for truth, then. I'm not good at this, at talking about feelings, at the social things that come easy to some folks. My parents, they died 5 years ago, like Mrs. Harper probably told you. Fever took them both. And when they were gone, I realized I was alone in a way I'd never been before." He stared out the window, his profile sharp against the afternoon light. "I tried courting before. There was a girl in town, Sarah Michaels. Pretty, sweet, everything a man should want. But when it came down to it, she couldn't see herself on a ranch, couldn't imagine the isolation and the hard work. She married a banker from Denver instead." He turned back to Lillian, his eyes steady. "So I understand desperate measures, Miss Moore. I wrote to that broker because I was lonely enough that it ached. Because I wanted someone to talk to over breakfast, someone to share the work and the silence with. Because a house without anyone in it starts to feel like a tomb." Lillian's throat tightened. This was the man from the letters, the one who'd written about loneliness without self-pity, about wanting partnership more than romance. Seeing him say these things aloud, watching the honesty in his face, made it all suddenly real in a way the letters never had. "I don't expect you to love me," Samuel continued. "Not right away, maybe not ever. But I'm hoping we might like each other, respect each other, build something practical that might, over time, become something more." He finally took a drink of his coffee, then added quietly, "And I promise you this, whatever you were running from back in Boston, you'll never have to fear that kind of treatment from me. I'm not a drinking man, and I know the difference between a wife and property." The cake sat untouched between them, but Lillian picked up her tea just to have something to do with her hands. The liquid was hot and slightly bitter, nothing like the good tea her mother used to serve in Boston, but she drank it anyway. What exactly would you expect from me? In this practical arrangement? Samuel seemed to consider this carefully. Help running the house if you're willing. I'm not much of a cook beyond basic trail food, and the place shows it. Help with the books, too. Managing the ranch accounts, keeping track of supplies and sales. You mentioned in your letters that you're good with numbers. I kept my brother-in-law's accounts for 2 years. He was terrible at it. Then you're already more qualified than I am. Samuel's mouth quirked slightly. Beyond that, company, I suppose. Someone to talk to about things other than cattle and weather. Someone who might tell me when I'm being stubborn about something. He paused. And eventually, if we both agree to it, children, a family. But that's for later, when we've had time to know each other. I won't rush you into anything, Miss Moore. You'll have your own room, your own space, for as long as you need it. Lillian studied his face, looking for deception or hidden agendas, but found only earnest hope tempered with nervousness. How long do you think that would take? For us to know each other well enough to decide? I don't know, Samuel admitted. A few months, maybe? We could have a long engagement, if that would make you more comfortable. Give us time to see if we suit each other. He leaned forward slightly. I know this isn't romantic, Miss Moore. I know you probably imagined something different for your life. A proper courtship, falling in love, all the things young people are supposed to have. And I'm sorry I can't offer you that fairy tale. But what I can offer is honesty and patience and a home where you'll be valued. That's worth something, isn't it? It was worth something. It was worth quite a lot, actually. More than she'd had in Boston, certainly. More than many women ever got. Yes, Lillian said softly. It's worth something. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Samuel seemed to remember the cake. You should eat. My aunt used to say no serious decision should be made on an empty stomach. Lillian took a bite, and despite everything, she had to suppress a sound of pleasure. It was good cake, moist and perfectly spiced, with a hint of cinnamon and nutmeg that reminded her of autumns in New England. This is excellent. Mrs. Hendricks is known for her baking. Her pies win the county fair every year. Samuel ate some of his own slice, then added, If you decide to stay, you'll meet her properly. She and her husband run this hotel. Good people. Most folks here are good people, actually. Hardworking, honest. They'll be curious about you at first, but once they get used to you being here, they'll welcome you in. Tell me about them, Lillian said impulsively. About the town. About your neighbors. I want to know what I'd be joining. Samuel's face brightened with something like relief, as if he'd been hoping she'd show interest, hoping she'd see beyond just her own fears to the life he was offering. Well, there's Doc Miller. He's been here since before I was born, delivered half the babies in the valley and patched up the other half after bar fights and accidents. He's gruff but kind, and he always brings books when he makes his rounds. Got me reading Dickens when I was recovering from a broken leg at 15. He warmed to the subject, his voice losing some of its nervous edge. Then there's the Chen family. They came from San Francisco about 10 years ago, opened a laundry and dry goods store. Their daughter May teaches some of the children Chinese and English both. Smart as anything, that girl. And Father Brennan at the church? He's Catholic, but we're short on clergy out here, so he does services for anyone who wants them, regardless of denomination. Gives good advice, too, if you ever need someone to talk to. Lillian listened, beginning to build a mental picture of Dust Valley, not just a rough frontier town, but a community of people trying to make lives in hard country. It sounds like a good place. It is. It's not Boston, won't ever be. No theaters or symphonies or fancy shops. But it's real. People here depend on each other, help each other through the hard times. Samuel finished his cake and pushed the plate aside. My ranch is about 5 miles out of town. Not too far for visiting when the weather's good, but isolated enough that you'd be on your own most days. I need to be honest about that. It can be lonely, especially at first. I'm used to lonely, Lillian said quietly. Samuel's eyes met hers with understanding. Maybe we both are. Maybe that's why this could work. They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually becoming easier as the initial awkwardness faded. Samuel told her about his ranch, 300 acres of grazing land, a herd of about 50 cattle, a few horses, chickens, and a milk cow. The house was small, but solid, built by his father 20 years ago and maintained with care. There was a vegetable garden that had mostly gone to weeds since his mother's death, a barn that needed some repair, and a creek that ran through the property providing fresh water year-round. Lillian, in turn, told him more about her life in Boston, not the desperate part she'd already revealed, but the better memories. The way her mother had taught her to arrange flowers and manage a household. Her father's small library, where she'd spent hours reading anything she could reach. Her sister Elizabeth's laugh, which had been rare but beautiful when it came. "You miss her," Samuel observed gently. "Every day. She was 5 years older than me, practically raised me after our mother died. When she married Thomas, I thought she'd be happy, but he changed after the wedding. Or maybe he was always like that and hid it well." Lillian's fingers tightened around her teacup. "I couldn't save her. Couldn't make her leave him. Couldn't make him treat her better. And watching her slowly give up, slowly fade, that was worse than her dying, in some ways." Samuel reached across the table then, his hand stopping just short of touching hers, a gesture of comfort that respected her space. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. That's a hard lesson, but it's true." His voice carried the weight of his own losses. "When my parents died, I kept thinking I should have noticed they were sick sooner, should have gotten the doctor faster, should have done something different. But Doc Miller told me that sometimes there's nothing to be done. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts." "How did you cope after they were gone?" "Work, mostly. I threw myself into the ranch, into keeping busy every hour of every day so I wouldn't have time to think." Samuel's expression grew rueful. "It helped, but it also kept me from actually dealing with the grief. Just buried it under exhaustion. Took me a few years to understand that I'd isolated myself so thoroughly that I was barely living, just existing, going through motions. That's when I realized I needed to change something, needed to let someone in again. And that led to the letter to the marriage broker." "That led to you," Samuel corrected softly. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and hope and fear, all tangled together. Outside the window, the afternoon sun was beginning its slide toward evening, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. A few townspeople passed by on the boardwalk, some glancing curiously at the couple in the window, others studiously minding their own business. "I need time," Lillian said finally. "Not months necessarily, but some time. A few weeks to see if I can imagine this life, if I can imagine myself here. Is that acceptable?" "More than acceptable." Samuel's relief was visible. "Take as long as you need. In the meantime, would you like to see the ranch, tomorrow maybe? I could pick you up in the morning, show you the place, let you get a sense of what it's like. No pressure, just so you can make an informed decision." The thought of seeing the place Samuel called home, of walking through the spaces he'd described in his letters, sent a flutter of something through Lillian's chest, anticipation, maybe, mixed with lingering nervousness. "Yes, I'd like that." "Good, that's good." Samuel stood, reaching for his hat. "I should let you get back to Mrs. Harper's. Get some proper rest. It's been a long day for you." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Miss Moore, for being honest with me, for giving this a chance. I know it's asking a lot." Lillian rose as well, gathering Mrs. Harper's shawl around her shoulders. "You're taking just as much of a risk as I am, Mr. Reed, inviting a stranger into your home, trusting in letters and hope. That takes courage, too." They walked out of the hotel together, into the cooling evening air. The street was quieter now, the day's business winding down. Samuel walked her back to the boarding house, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough that their arms almost brushed. When they reached Mrs. Harper's porch, he stopped and turned to face her. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning?" he asked. "I'll bring the wagon around." "I'll be ready." Samuel nodded, settled his hat on his head, then seemed to think better of it and removed it again. "Miss Moore, Lillian, if I may, I just want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you choose to stay, I'll do everything I can to make you happy here. And if you decide this isn't right for you, I'll help you get wherever you want to go next. You're not trapped by coming here. You always have choices. The generosity of that statement, the genuine care behind it, made Lillian's eyes sting with unexpected tears. Thank you, Samuel. That means more than you know. He nodded once more, then finally took his leave, striding down the street toward where his wagon was presumably parked. Lillian watched until he turned the corner and disappeared from view, then went inside to find Mrs. Harper waiting in the parlor with knowing eyes and a pot of fresh tea. "Well?" the older woman asked. "How did it go?" "I don't know," Lillian admitted, sinking into the offered chair. "Good, I think. He's a good man, isn't he?" "I told you so this morning," Mrs. Harper said, pouring tea. "Samuel Reed is one of the best men I've known in my 23 years here. Reliable, honest, hard-working. His parents raised him right, and he's patient, which you'll need if you're going to adjust to ranch life. He's taking me to see the place tomorrow." "Good. You should see it. Walk through it. Imagine yourself there. A home says a lot about the person who keeps it." Mrs. Harper handed her a cup. "And you should know, the townspeople are already talking about you, wondering if you'll stay, if you're suitable for Samuel. Some are betting you'll run back to Boston within a month." The bluntness of it stung, but Lillian appreciated the honesty. "What are you betting?" Mrs. Harper's eyes crinkled with a smile. "I'm betting you're stronger than you look. Anyone who makes that journey alone, who steps off that coach despite being terrified, who sits down with a stranger and speaks honestly about difficult things, that's not a woman who gives up easy." "I want to believe that," Lillian said quietly. "I want to believe I can be that person." "Then be her. Choose it, every day, until it's not a choice anymore, but just who you are." Mrs. Harper stood collecting the tea things. "Now you must be exhausted. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day." In her small room, Lillian prepared for bed with careful attention, washing her face, braiding her hair, hanging her dress to air out before sleeping in her thin cotton nightgown. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston, where city lights drowned them out. She thought about Samuel Reed, about his honesty and his patience, about the way he'd offered her choices even when it might have been easier to push for immediate answers. She thought about his ranch, about the house with curtains in the windows, about the possibility of building something good in this strange, hard, beautiful country. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been in Boston, afraid and trapped, and slowly disappearing under the weight of other people's expectations. About the woman she might become here if she was brave enough to try. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless. When Lillian woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through yellow curtains, her first coherent thought was not fear, but curiosity. What would Samuel's ranch look like? What would it feel like to walk through those rooms, to stand on that land, to imagine her future taking shape in 3 dimensions instead of just words on paper? She dressed carefully in her most practical clothes, a brown skirt and cream blouse that wouldn't show dirt too readily. She pinned her hair up simply, then joined the other boarders for breakfast in Mrs. Harper's dining room. The school teacher, Miss Peters, was a thin young woman with wire-rimmed spectacles who nodded politely but seemed too absorbed in a book to make conversation. Mr. Cho, the tailor, smiled kindly and complimented her dress. Old Mr. Brennan ignored everyone in favor of his oatmeal. By 10 o'clock, Lillian was waiting on the porch, her borrowed shawl draped over her arm, her heart beating faster than it should have been. When Samuel's wagon rounded the corner, she felt her breath catch. He'd dressed much as he had yesterday, clean, careful, his hat pulled low against the morning sun. But seeing him in daylight, in his element, she noticed things she'd missed before. The easy way he handled the horses, the confidence in his posture, the sense that he belonged to this landscape in a way she might never manage. "Morning," he called, pulling the horses to a stop. "Ready to see the place?" Lillian descended the porch steps, accepted his hand up onto the wagon seat, and settled beside him as he clicked to the horses. The wagon lurched into motion, carrying her away from the relative safety of town and toward the unknown future that waited 5 miles down a dusty road. And despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the strangeness of it all, Lillian found herself leaning forward slightly, eager to see what came next. The wagon rolled through Dust Valley's main street, passing the general store where a woman was sweeping the boardwalk. the church with its modest steeple, reaching toward the endless sky, the saloon already emanating the faint sound of morning piano practice. Samuel nodded to people as they passed, and Lillian felt their curious gazes following the wagon, the rancher and his mail-order bride, heading out to the Reed place where everyone knew a decision would be made. Once they left the town behind, the landscape opened up in ways that stole Lillian's breath. Rolling grasslands stretched in every direction, golden in the morning light, punctuated by clusters of sage and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees marking where water ran. The mountains rose in the distance like sentinels, their peaks still touched with snow that seemed impossibly white against the deep blue sky. The air smelled different out here, clean and sharp, carrying hints of sage and earth and something wild that had no name. "It's beautiful," Lillian said, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. Samuel glanced at her, seeming pleased. "It grows on you. When I was young, I thought it was boring, too much space, not enough happening. But after I went to Denver for a year to learn ranching from my uncle, I couldn't wait to get back. All those buildings and people and noise, it felt like I couldn't breathe properly." He guided the horses around a rut in the road. "Out here, you can hear yourself think." "What do you think about? Out here in all this quiet?" "Depends on the day." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes practical things. Which pasture needs rotating, when to take the cattle to market, whether that section of fence will hold through winter. Other times, bigger questions. What I'm doing with my life. Whether I'm living the way my parents would have wanted. Whether I'm going to spend the rest of my days talking to horses because I'm too stubborn to let anyone else in." The honesty of it made Lillian's chest tight. "You let me in, through those letters." "Letters are easier. You can think about what to say, cross out the parts that sound foolish, present yourself the way you want to be seen." He shifted the reins to one hand. "Face to face, you get the whole truth. The awkward pauses, the words that come out wrong, the way a man's hands shake when he's nervous." Lillian looked at his hands, steady on the reins now, and remembered how they'd trembled slightly when he'd first offered one to help her from the stagecoach. "I think the whole truth is better than the edited version. Harder, but better." "That's a generous way to look at it." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the clip of hooves, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Lillian found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it, into the warmth of the sun on her face, and the surprising comfort of Samuel's presence beside her. He wasn't chattering to fill the silence or pushing conversation where it didn't want to go. He simply drove, comfortable in his own skin and the landscape around him, giving her space to absorb it all. "There," Samuel said finally, pointing ahead to where a break in the grassland revealed a cluster of buildings. "That's home." Lillian leaned forward, her pulse quickening. The house was smaller than she'd imagined, a single-story structure of weathered wood with a covered porch running along the front. But even from a distance, she could see care in its maintenance. The roof looked solid, the windows intact, and those curtains he'd mentioned were visible, white cotton moving slightly in the breeze. Behind the house stood a barn, larger than the house itself, painted red at some point, though the color had faded to a soft rust. A chicken coop, a small shed, and a corral completed the cluster of structures, but it was the land itself that captured Lillian's attention. The property rolled gently down to a line of trees that must mark the creek Samuel had mentioned. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. And beyond it all, the mountains stood watch, massive and ancient and utterly indifferent to human hopes and fears. "It's not much," Samuel said, and there was vulnerability in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I know it's smaller than what you're probably used to in Boston, but it's solid, and there's room to grow if things go well." "It's wonderful," Lillian said, and meant it. The house might be small, but there was something honest about it, something real. This wasn't pretense or appearances. This was a life built with actual hands, sustained by actual work. "Can we go inside?" Samuel's shoulders relaxed. "That's why we're here." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful at her waist, releasing her the moment her feet touched the ground. The chickens scattered as they approached, clucking indignantly, and a large orange cat appeared from the barn to wind around Samuel's legs. "That's Rusty," Samuel said, bending to scratch the cat's ears. He's supposed to catch mice in the barn, but mostly he just supervises. Been here longer than I have. Was my mother's cat originally. Lillian knelt, extending her hand for Rusty to sniff. The cat regarded her with inscrutable yellow eyes for a moment, then bumped his head against her fingers in apparent approval. I think he likes me. Rusty's a good judge of character. My mother always said so. Samuel straightened. Ready to see inside? The porch steps were solid under Lillian's feet, and she noticed details as they climbed. A rocking chair positioned to catch the evening sun. A few pots that had once held flowers but now held only dry soil. A pair of work boots set neatly by the door. Samuel opened the door, which wasn't locked, and gestured for her to enter first. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but as Lillian's eyes adjusted, she began to make out details. They'd entered directly into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A wood stove dominated one wall, with a work table and shelves nearby holding basic cooking equipment. A larger table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, and beyond that, a worn sofa faced a stone fireplace. Everything was clean but sparse, functional rather than comfortable. It's not much for decoration, Samuel said, hovering in the doorway as if afraid to crowd her. My mother had knickknacks and such, pictures on the walls, but after she passed I packed most of it away. Didn't seem right, leaving them out when she wasn't here to enjoy them. Lillian moved deeper into the room, running her fingers along the back of a chair. The wood was smooth, well-maintained. You could bring them back out. She'd probably want the house to feel lived in, not like a museum. Maybe. Samuel closed the door behind him. That door there leads to the bedroom. My parents' room, though it's mine now. The other door goes to a smaller room that was mine growing up. I thought, if you decided to stay, that could be yours, for as long as you wanted privacy. He showed her both rooms. The main bedroom was larger, with a double bed covered in a quilt that showed skilled handiwork, a bureau, and a wardrobe. It was tidy but impersonal, as if Samuel lived in it without really inhabiting it. The smaller room held a single bed, a small bureau, and not much else, but the window looked out over the creek and the mountains beyond. I cleaned it out last week, Samuel said. Put fresh linens on the bed, cleared space in the bureau. I wanted you to have somewhere that felt like yours, right from the start. The thoughtfulness of it, the care he'd taken to prepare for her arrival, made Lillian's throat tight. Thank you. No one's done something like that for me in a long time. They returned to the main room, and Samuel moved to the stove. Let me make coffee. We can sit, talk some more. Or I can show you the rest of the property, if you'd rather. Coffee first, Lillian decided. She was still absorbing the house, trying to imagine herself here, cooking at that stove, eating at that table, sleeping in that small bedroom with its view of the mountains. It felt both impossible and oddly right, like putting on a dress that didn't quite fit but might with some alterations. Samuel worked efficiently, building up the fire in the stove and setting a pot of water to heat. Lillian watched his movements, noting the economy of them, the way he knew exactly where everything was and how to use it. This was his domain, his territory, and he moved through it with unconscious grace. You mentioned your parents built this place, Lillian said. How long were they here? 23 years. They came out from Missouri when they were newly married, staked this claim, and built the house with their own hands. Took them a full year. They lived in the barn while they worked on it. Samuel measured coffee into the pot. My mother used to tell stories about that first winter, how cold it was, how they'd wake up with frost on the inside of the barn walls. But they were together, she'd say, and that made it bearable. They loved each other, very much. Not in a showy way, but you could feel it, the way they worked together, finished each other's sentences, made each other laugh. Samuel's expression grew distant with memory. I always thought I'd have that someday, the kind of partnership they had. But Sarah wanted something different, and after that fell apart, I figured maybe I'd been aiming too high. Maybe it was enough to find someone practical, someone I respected. He brought 2 cups to the table, and Lillian sat across from him just as she had in the hotel dining room yesterday. But this felt different, more intimate, more real. This was his home, his life he was showing her. This was the space where a decision made would have immediate, tangible consequences. What if it becomes more than practical, Lillian asked. What if we find we actually like each other, care about each other? Samuel met her eyes over his coffee cup. Then I'd count myself the luckiest man in Colorado. He paused. But I don't want to pressure you with expectations, Lillian. I don't want you to feel like you have to develop feelings you don't have. If we can build a life on mutual respect and shared work, that's enough. Anything more would be a gift. You deserve more than enough, Lillian said softly. You deserve someone who sees how good you are, how patient and kind. You deserve what your parents had. So do you. Samuel's voice was equally soft. You deserve better than running from a bad situation. You deserve to be chosen, not just accepted out of desperation. They sat in silence, the weight of mutual understanding settling between them. Outside, a cow lowed in the distance. The coffee grew cool in their cups. And Lillian felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the fear that had gripped her since Boston, a tentative opening toward possibility. Can we walk the property? She asked. I'd like to see the rest of it. Samuel's face brightened. Of course. Let me show you the barn first. That's where most of the work happens. The barn was indeed impressive, solid construction, with stalls for horses, space for hay storage, and various pieces of equipment that Samuel named but which meant nothing to Lillian. 2 horses occupied stalls, their heads turning with interest as Samuel led her through. This is Buck, and this is Sally, Samuel introduced them, stopping to stroke each horse's nose. Buck's my riding horse, good for herding cattle and making trips to town. Sally's gentler, better for wagon work. You could learn to ride her if you wanted. Might be nice to be able to get to town on your own when I'm out working the range. The idea of riding a horse, of having that kind of independence, appealed to Lillian more than she'd expected. I'd like that. I've never ridden before. I'll teach you. It's not as hard as it looks, once you trust the horse. Samuel moved toward the back of the barn, where light filtered through gaps in the boards. And out here is the real treasure. He opened a door and stepped aside, revealing a view that made Lillian gasp. The land sloped down to the creek he'd mentioned, but it wasn't just a creek. It was a ribbon of silver water running through a corridor of cottonwood trees, their leaves whispering in the breeze. The grass here was greener, lusher, and wildflowers she couldn't name splashed color across the banks. This is why my father chose this spot, Samuel said, pride evident in his voice. Year-round water, good grazing, shelter from the worst weather. In summer, it's the prettiest place in the whole valley. They walked down toward the water, Samuel pointing out various features. The shallow crossing where cattle could drink safely, the deeper pool where he sometimes caught fish, the flat rock his mother had loved to sit on while reading. Lillian listened and observed, but more than that, she felt. She felt the peace of this place, the sense of something enduring and good. She felt the care Samuel had for it, the way he knew every rock and tree. And she felt something in herself responding to it, some part of her that had been holding its breath for years suddenly able to draw in air. At the creek's edge, Samuel bent to pick up a flat stone and skipped it across the water, 3 bounces before it sank. I used to spend hours doing this as a kid. Drove my father crazy, all the chores I'd neglect to play by the creek. Lillian picked up her own stone, felt its weight in her palm. Teach me? Samuel showed her how to hold it, how to snap her wrist, the angle needed to make it work. Her first 3 attempts sent stones plopping straight into the water without bouncing, and she laughed, genuinely laughed, at her own ineptitude. Samuel laughed too, the sound warm and free, and Lillian realized it was probably the first time she'd heard him laugh. It transformed his face, erasing the seriousness and showing the younger man he must have been before loss and loneliness had marked him. Her 4th stone skipped once before sinking. I did it! You're a natural, Samuel said, grinning. Another month and you'll be showing me up. They skipped stones for a while longer, the absurdity of 2 adults playing like children not lost on either of them. But it felt necessary somehow, this moment of lightness after so much weight. It felt like a glimpse of what life here could be, not just work and survival, but moments of simple joy. Eventually, they walked back toward the house, taking a different path that led through the overgrown vegetable garden Samuel had mentioned. Posts and string marked where rows had once been orderly, but now weeds had taken over, though Lillian could make out the struggling shapes of tomato plants and what might have been beans. My mother's pride, Samuel said, his voice tinged with sadness. She could grow anything. After she died, I tried to keep it up, but I don't have her touch. Everything I plant either drowns or dries up. Lillian knelt, pushing aside weeds to reveal a patch of herbs, mint, she thought, and possibly sage. Still alive despite neglect, stubbornly growing. It just needs attention, someone who understands it. She looked up at Samuel. I helped my mother with her garden in Boston. I'm not an expert, but I know the basics. I could bring this back. You'd want to? I'd like to try. Lillian stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. I'd like to grow things again. I'd forgotten how satisfying it is, putting seeds in the ground and watching life come from them. Samuel's expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise, hope, something that might have been the beginning of affection. Then it's yours. Do whatever you want with it. I'll help with the heavy work, but the planning and planting, that would be all you. They walked the rest of the property, Samuel showing her where the cattle grazed, explaining the rotation system he used to keep the grass healthy, pointing out landmarks he used for orientation. Lillian absorbed it all, asking questions, trying to understand the rhythm of ranch life. It was overwhelming in its complexity, but also fascinating. This wasn't the abstract romance of the West from dime novels. This was real work, real challenges, real satisfaction when things went right. By the time they returned to the house, the sun had climbed high, and Lillian's stomach was reminding her they'd skipped lunch. Samuel must have noticed because he offered to make sandwiches, and they ate on the front porch, watching Rusty chase something through the grass. What are you thinking? Samuel asked after they'd eaten in comfortable silence. Lillian considered the question carefully. I'm thinking this is a beautiful place. I'm thinking you've built something good here, something worth being part of. I'm thinking... She paused, gathering courage. I'm thinking I could be happy here. If you're patient with me while I learn. If you don't mind that I'll make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. That's how we learn. Samuel set his plate aside. I need to be honest with you about something, Lillian. I told you this started as letters and duty, a practical arrangement, and that's true. But sitting here with you now, watching you light up when you talked about the garden, hearing you laugh by the creek, I need you to know that this isn't just practical for me anymore. Lillian's heart beat faster. What is it then? It's hope. Real hope, for the first time in years. Hope that maybe I won't spend the rest of my life alone. Hope that this house might hear laughter again, might feel like a home instead of just a place I sleep. He turned to face her fully. I know it's too soon to call it anything more. We've only just met, really. But I want you to know that I see you, Lillian Moore, not just as a solution to loneliness, but as someone I genuinely want to know, someone I could... He stopped, seeming to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. Someone you could what? Lillian prompted, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability and courage warring with each other. Someone I could love, given time, given a chance. The words hung between them, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Lillian's first instinct was to retreat, to protect herself from the possibility of hurt. But looking at Samuel's open, honest face, at the home he'd prepared for her, at the life he was offering, not perfect, not easy, but real and solid and good, she found herself leaning toward courage instead of fear. I think, she said slowly, that I could love you too. I don't yet. I can't. We barely know each other. But I feel something. A beginning, maybe. The seed of something that could grow into something real. Samuel's breath released in a rush. That's enough. That's more than enough. They sat together on the porch as the afternoon wore on, talking about smaller things now that the largest truth had been spoken. Samuel told her about the neighbors. The nearest ranch was 3 miles east, owned by the Johnsons, a family with 5 children who might appreciate Lillian's company. There was a small school in town that was always looking for help with teaching. The traveling preacher came through once a month to hold services. Lillian told him about her hopes for the garden, about the books she'd brought with her in that trunk, about her fear of cattle, but willingness to learn. They discussed practical matters, how much money she had left, whether she should keep the room at Mrs. Harper's or move to the ranch sooner, what kind of engagement period would be appropriate. The reverend who comes through, his name's Father Brennan, he's the one I mentioned. He usually suggests a month's engagement minimum, Samuel said. Gives couples time to know each other, to be sure. But we could make it longer if you wanted. 2 months, 3, whatever you need. A month feels both too short and too long, Lillian admitted. Too short to know someone fully, too long when every day at Mrs. Harper's costs money I don't have much of. I'll pay for the room, Samuel said immediately. That's not a burden or a loan. Consider it an investment in our future. I want you to have time to be sure without worrying about finances. That's generous, but no buts. I mean it, Lillian. I'm not trying to buy your agreement or put you in debt to me. I'm trying to give you the space to choose freely. He stood, stretching his legs. It's getting late. I should get you back to town before Mrs. Harper starts worrying. The ride back was quieter than the ride out, but the silence felt different now, full of possibility rather than awkward with uncertainty. Lillian found herself studying Samuel's profile, the way his hands held the reins, the set of his shoulders. This man who'd been a stranger yesterday was becoming real to her, three-dimensional, someone she could imagine beside her through seasons and years. When they reached Mrs. Harper's boarding house, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting everything in warm gold light. Samuel helped Lillian down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Lillian said, "for showing me your home, for your honesty. Thank you for giving it a chance. For giving me a chance." Samuel stepped back, maintaining propriety despite what Lillian suspected was an urge to stay close. "I'll come by tomorrow, if that's all right. Maybe we could walk around town some, let people meet you properly. The sooner you feel part of the community, the easier the adjustment will be." "I'd like that." Samuel nodded, climbed back onto the wagon, then paused before taking up the reins. "Lillian, that thing you said about the seed of something that could grow, I've been thinking about that image all afternoon. It's a good one. Hopeful. Patient. Exactly what we need." "Then let's tend it carefully," Lillian said. "See what it becomes." She watched him drive away, then turned to find Mrs. Harper watching from the parlor window with an expression that suggested she'd witnessed the entire farewell. When Lillian entered, the older woman was already pouring tea. "So?" Mrs. Harper asked without preamble. "Did you like the ranch?" "I loved it," Lillian admitted, accepting the teacup. "It's beautiful and lonely, and exactly what he described. And Samuel—" She paused, searching for words. "He's exactly what he seemed in the letters. Maybe better." "Better how?" "He's giving me choices. He's not rushing me or demanding anything. He's just hoping. And somehow that makes me want to choose him even more than if he were pushing." Mrs. Harper smiled knowingly. "That's Samuel for you. His parents taught him that anything worth having is worth waiting for. And you're definitely worth waiting for, dear." That night, Lillian lay in her small rented room and thought about the day. She thought about skipping stones by the creek, about the overgrown garden waiting to be revived, about the way Samuel's face had transformed when he laughed. She thought about the small bedroom with the view of the mountains, about the possibility of learning to ride horses and grow vegetables and build a life in this hard, beautiful country. And for the first time since leaving Boston, Lillian didn't feel like she was running away from something. She felt like she was running toward something, toward hope, toward belonging, toward a man whose patience had given her permission to be afraid and brave at the same time. She fell asleep with moonlight streaming through yellow curtains and dreamed of gardens coming back to life. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that surprised Lillian with its sweetness. Samuel came to town almost daily, sometimes with errands that needed doing, sometimes with excuses so transparent they both smiled at the pretense. They walked the streets of Dust Valley together, and slowly, carefully, the town began to accept her presence. Mrs. Chen at the dry goods store taught her which fabrics held up best in the harsh climate. Doc Miller stopped them one afternoon to discuss a medical text he thought Lillian might enjoy, having heard from Mrs. Harper that she was well-read. Even the men at the saloon tipped their hats respectfully when they passed, recognizing her now as Samuel Reed's intended, rather than just another curious stranger. Father Brennan, the traveling preacher, arrived on a Tuesday with his circuit of services and sought them out specifically. He was older than Lillian had expected, perhaps 70, with white hair and eyes that seemed to see more than most people revealed. He met with them in the church, a small, plain building with wooden pews and wildflowers someone had placed by the simple altar. "So you're the young lady who finally got Samuel to stop being stubborn about his loneliness," Father Brennan said, his voice carrying a hint of Irish brogue despite what must have been decades in America. "I've been praying for this man to find someone for 5 years now." Good to see prayers answered. Lillian glanced at Samuel, who'd colored slightly at the priest's directness. "We're still getting to know each other, Father. Taking it slow. Slow is wise, but not too slow. Life's short and uncertain out here." Father Brennan settled into a pew and gestured for them to sit. "Now then, let's talk about what marriage means, what you're both expecting, what the church requires if you want me to perform the ceremony." They talked for over an hour. Father Brennan asked difficult questions about their reasons for marrying, their understanding of commitment, their willingness to work through inevitable conflicts. He asked Lillian if she felt pressured or coerced in any way, asked Samuel if he was prepared to honor his wife as an equal partner. Some of his questions made Lillian uncomfortable, but she appreciated his thoroughness. This wasn't a man who would marry two people without ensuring they understood the weight of what they were undertaking. "I'll be honest with you both," Father Brennan said finally. "I've married plenty of couples who started with less than you have. You're both being thoughtful, honest with yourselves and each other. That's more than most manage." He looked at Lillian particularly. "But I want you to know, young lady, that if you ever need counsel, if you're ever uncertain or afraid, or just need someone to talk to who isn't Samuel, my door is always open. Marriage is hard work, and it's easier when you have support." "Thank you, Father," Lillian said, meaning it. "That's kind of you." "Not kind, necessary. We look after our own out here." He stood, joints creaking audibly. "I'll be back through in 3 weeks. If you're both still certain by then, we'll have a wedding. Simple ceremony, but I'll make it proper and meaningful. In the meantime, I suggest you spend time together doing ordinary things. Don't just court each other, work alongside each other. See how you manage when things are difficult, not just when you're both on your best behavior." Samuel took that advice seriously. The next day, he arrived at Mrs. Harper's with a request. "I need to repair some fence line on the east pasture. It's not exciting work, but I thought maybe you'd like to come along, see what a regular work day looks like." Lillian agreed immediately, changing into her most practical clothes and borrowing a wide-brimmed hat from Mrs. Harper to protect against the sun. The fence repair turned out to be exactly as unglamorous as Samuel had suggested. Hot, repetitive work involving wooden posts, wire, and tools Lillian barely understood. But Samuel showed her how to hold posts steady while he hammered, explained the importance of proper tension in the wire, and pointed out places where animals had damaged the fence line. "Cattle aren't smart, but they're persistent," he said, wrestling with a particularly stubborn post. "They'll push on a weak spot until it gives. That's why you have to check the whole perimeter regularly, fix small problems before they become big ones." "Is that a metaphor?" Lillian asked, amused. Samuel paused, then grinned. "Maybe. Probably good advice for marriage, too, now that you mention it." They worked through the morning, stopping only when Samuel declared they needed to rest the horses and themselves. He'd brought food in his saddlebag, bread, cheese, apples, and a canteen of water. They sat in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, and Lillian found herself studying Samuel as he ate. His shirt was damp with sweat, his hands dirty from work, and there was a smudge of mud on his jaw that he seemed unaware of. He looked nothing like the gentlemen she'd known in Boston, with their soft hands and clean collars and lives built on inherited money rather than physical labor. She liked him better this way, real, solid, unashamed of honest work. "What?" Samuel asked, catching her staring. "Nothing. Just thinking that you're a good teacher, patient." "Had to be patient teaching myself most of this after my father died. Turns out patience comes easier when you don't have a choice." He took a drink of water, then offered the canteen to Lillian. "How are your hands holding up? Not used to this kind of work, I'd guess." Lillian examined her palms, which were already showing signs of blistering despite the gloves Samuel had insisted she wear. "They'll toughen up. They will. Everything does, eventually." His voice was gentle. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt while it's happening. If you need to stop, tell me. No shame in building calluses gradually. But Lillian didn't want to stop. Didn't want Samuel to think she was soft, incapable, another Sarah who'd look at ranch life and decide it was too hard. So she worked through the afternoon, helping with the fence line until Samuel declared it finished and they could head back to town. She was exhausted by the time they reached Mrs. Harper's, every muscle aching in ways she'd never experienced. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hand steadying her when her legs wobbled. "You did good work today," he said. "Real good. I know it probably doesn't feel like much, fixing fence line, but it matters. Keeps the cattle safe, prevents losses. You helped with something important." The praise warmed her more than it probably should have. "Can I come again? When you have other work days?" Samuel's face lit up. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." Mrs. Harper took one look at Lillian when she came inside and immediately drew a bath, insisting she soak her aching muscles and blistered hands. Later, over dinner with the other boarders, the school teacher Miss Peters commented on Lillian's sunburned nose and work-roughened appearance. "You're really going through with it then?" Miss Peters asked. "Marrying into ranch life?" "I think so, yes. It's hard work, harder than most people realize." Miss Peters' voice wasn't unkind, just factual. "I teach the ranch children, the ones whose families live too far out to come to town regularly. I see what that life does to people. The isolation, the endless labor, the way the weather and the land make every day a challenge." "But you also see the families who thrive," Mrs. Harper interjected firmly. "The ones who make it work, who build good lives out here. Don't discourage the girl." "I'm not discouraging, just being honest." Miss Peters turned to Lillian. "But if you're willing to work hard, if you're willing to learn, you'll do fine. Samuel Reed's a good man, better than most I've met out here." That night, soaking her blistered hands in the salve Mrs. Harper provided, Lillian thought about what Miss Peters had said. The isolation, the endless labor, the challenges, all of it was true, she was certain. But what the schoolteacher hadn't mentioned was the satisfaction she'd felt helping repair that fence line, the way Samuel's praise had made her feel valued, the sense that she was building something real rather than just existing in the margins of someone else's life. The days continued to pass, each one bringing new experiences. Samuel took her to meet the Johnson family at the neighboring ranch, where Lillian was immediately swept up by Mrs. Johnson, a cheerful, bustling woman with flour perpetually on her apron, and her 5 children ranging from 3 to 14. The children were curious and surprisingly welcoming, the younger ones showing Lillian their collection of interesting rocks, while the older ones peppered her with questions about Boston. "Do you miss the city?" asked Emma, the 14-year-old, her eyes dreamy with imagination. "All the people and shops and excitement?" Lillian considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss certain things, good bookstores, theater performances, the convenience of having everything close by. But I don't miss the crowds, the noise, the feeling of being anonymous in a sea of people." "Samuel's ranch is pretty isolated," Mr. Johnson said, joining the conversation. He was a weathered man with kind eyes and strong opinions. "Even more than ours. You'll be on your own a lot while he's working the range. Some women find that hard." "Some women thrive in it," Mrs. Johnson countered, shooting her husband a meaningful look. "Don't project your assumptions, Henry. Let the girl discover for herself what she likes." But the warning had been given, added to the growing list of cautions well-meaning people kept offering. The isolation, the loneliness, the hardship. As if Lillian hadn't already considered these things, hadn't already weighed them against the alternative of returning to Boston with nothing and no one. Samuel must have sensed her growing anxiety, because a few days later he arrived with a different kind of invitation. "There's a dance this Saturday at the town hall. Nothing fancy, just locals gathering to socialize and forget about work for an evening. I thought maybe you'd like to go. Meet more people in a setting that's less about evaluating your ranching potential and more about just having fun." Lillian hadn't been to a dance in years. The thought of it sent a flutter of nervousness through her chest, but also something else. Anticipation. "I don't have anything appropriate to wear." "It's not that kind of dance. Just wear whatever you're comfortable in. Half the women will be in their everyday dresses, and nobody cares." He paused. "But if you wanted to get something new, Mrs. Chen has some nice fabrics. I'd be happy to—" "No," Lillian interrupted gently. "You've already been too generous with Mrs. Harper's room fees. I won't have you buying me dresses too. I'll make do with what I have." But Mrs. Harper had other ideas. That evening, she appeared in Lillian's room with a dress over her arm, deep blue cotton with tiny white flowers embroidered along the neckline. "This was my daughter's," she said quietly. "She passed 10 years ago, fever, and I've been keeping her things like a foolish old woman. But I think she'd like knowing her dress was being worn to a dance, being useful rather than just gathering dust." As Lillian's throat tightened, "Mrs. Harper, I couldn't possibly—" "You can, and you will. It'll need taking in at the waist. You're slimmer than Margaret was, but otherwise it should fit. And before you protest about charity, know that you're doing me a favor. Letting go is hard, but it's necessary. This dress deserves to dance again." Saturday arrived with perfect weather, warm but not hot, with a breeze that promised a comfortable evening. Lillian dressed carefully in Margaret Harper's blue dress, which Mrs. Harper had indeed altered to fit. The fabric was soft from years of storage, and the tiny embroidered flowers caught the light beautifully. She arranged her hair in a style that was simple but elegant, and for the first time since arriving in Dust Valley, she felt almost pretty. Samuel's face when he came to collect her confirmed the feeling. He stared for a moment, his prepared greeting apparently forgotten, before managing. "You look beautiful." "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." He did. He dressed in his best clothes, dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, a vest, and a string tie. His hair was neatly combed, his boots polished, and he carried himself with an almost boyish excitement that made Lillian smile. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived, filled with ranchers and townspeople, children darting between adult legs, and musicians tuning their instruments in the corner. Tables lined one wall, laden with food that everyone had contributed to: pies and cakes, fried chicken, potato salad, and dishes Lillian couldn't identify but that smelled delicious. Samuel kept a protective hand at the small of her back as they navigated the crowd, introducing her to what felt like dozens of people whose names Lillian struggled to remember. But everyone was friendly, welcoming her with varying degrees of curiosity and warmth. The women particularly seemed eager to talk to her, asking about Boston and her journey west with the kind of fascination that suggested such adventures were far removed from their daily lives. When the music started, a lively fiddle tune, Samuel turned to her with an almost shy expression. "I should probably warn you that I'm not much of a dancer. My mother tried to teach me, but I never quite got the hang of it." "Then we'll fumble through it together," Lillian said, taking his offered hand. They joined the other couples on the floor, and Samuel proved to be a better dancer than he'd claimed, competent if not graceful, able to lead her through the basic steps without trampling her feet. Lillian found herself laughing as they spun, feeling lighter than she had in years. Around them, the community of Dust Valley danced and laughed and celebrated the simple joy of music and companionship. Between dances, people pulled them aside for conversations. Mr. Chen asked about her interest in education, mentioning that the school always needed volunteers. Doc Miller introduced her to his wife, a formidable woman who immediately began discussing which medical texts Lillian should read. Mrs. Johnson cornered them with her husband to discuss a barn raising they were planning for next month, assuming Lillian and Samuel would attend as a married couple. "We're not quite there yet," Samuel said carefully. "Still have a couple weeks before the wedding." "If there is a wedding," added a new voice, cool and feminine. Lillian turned to see a pretty blonde woman approaching, her dress fashionably cut and her expression carefully neutral. After all, Miss Moore might decide ranch life isn't for her. Not everyone is cut out for it. Samuel's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Lillian's waist. "Sarah, I didn't know you'd be here." "Mother insisted. She thought I should pay my respects to your fiancé." Sarah Michaels, for it could only be her, the woman Samuel had courted before, smiled without warmth. "Welcome to Dust Valley, Miss Moore. I hope you find it suitable." The encounter lasted only moments before Sarah drifted away to join a group of other young women, but it left Lillian feeling unsettled. Samuel noticed immediately. Don't let her get to you, he said quietly. Sarah's bitter that I didn't chase after her to Denver, but that's not your concern. Did you love her? Lillian heard herself ask. Samuel was quiet for a moment as he led her through a slower dance. I thought I did. But looking back, I think I loved the idea of her more than the reality. She was pretty and proper, everything I thought I was supposed to want. But we didn't talk the way you and I do, didn't share ideas or laugh at the same things. It was all surface, no depth. He met her eyes. What we have, what we're building, that's real. Don't doubt it because of Sarah. But doubt had crept in anyway, a small worm of uncertainty. Sarah was beautiful and polished, everything Lillian wasn't. Sarah belonged here in a way Lillian still didn't. And Sarah's pointed comment about ranch life not being suitable, was that just jealousy, or was it a truth Lillian was too naive to see? The evening continued, but some of the magic had dimmed. Lillian smiled and danced and made conversation, but part of her mind was elsewhere, questioning everything. When Samuel finally took her back to Mrs. Harper's, she was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. You're quiet, Samuel observed as they stood on the boarding house porch. Music from the hall still drifted on the night air, but here it was peaceful, intimate. Sarah really got to you, didn't she? I'm being foolish. You're being human. Samuel took her hand carefully, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Let me tell you something about Sarah Michaels. She's not wrong that ranch life is hard. It is. But the reason she couldn't handle it wasn't the work or the isolation. It was that she was only thinking about herself. What she wanted, what she needed, what would make her comfortable. She never once asked what I needed, what would make the ranch succeed, how we could work together. He squeezed Lillian's hand gently. You've spent 2 weeks asking questions, learning, working alongside me. You've blistered your hands fixing fence and gotten sunburned working in the garden. You've made an effort to know this community, these people. That's the difference, Lillian. That's why I believe we can make this work. But what if I can't? The fear bubbled up, couldn't be contained. What if I try and fail? What if a year from now I'm miserable and you regret choosing me and we're trapped in something neither of us wants anymore? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, what if we succeed? What if a year from now we're sitting on that porch watching the sunset, talking about our day, and we realize we're happy? What if we build something good together? He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with old-fashioned gallantry. Fear is natural, Lillian. I'm scared too, but I'm more afraid of not trying than I am of trying and failing. Lillian looked into his face. Honest, patient, steady Samuel, who'd never once pushed her beyond what she could handle, who'd given her time and space and choices, who was offering her not just escape but belonging. 3 weeks, she said. Father Brennan will be back in 3 weeks. Is that you saying yes? Lillian took a shaky breath. That's me saying I want to say yes, that I think I will say yes, but I need these last 3 weeks to be certain. Samuel's smile was like sunrise. Then take them. Use them however you need. I'll be here, waiting, hoping. And whatever you decide, I'll respect it. He left her on the porch with that promise hanging in the air. Lillian watched him walk to his wagon, mount it, drive away into the night. Then she went inside to find Mrs. Harper waiting with tea and understanding eyes. You're going to marry him, the older woman said. It wasn't a question. I think I am. Good. He deserves someone who sees his worth, and you deserve someone who sees yours. Mrs. Harper poured tea with steady hands. Now tell me what that Michaels girl said to upset you. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and growing certainty. Lillian spent more time at the ranch, cleaning and organizing, bringing life back to rooms that had felt dead. She worked in the garden every day, clearing weeds and preparing soil for spring planting. She learned to milk the cow, a humiliating process at first, full of spilled buckets and frustrated animal protests, but gradually she got the hang of it. She learned to collect eggs without frightening the chickens, to recognize which fence sections needed watching, to read the weather signs that Samuel checked every morning. And she learned Samuel, his morning gruffness that faded with coffee, his habit of talking to the horses as if they understood every word, the way he touched his father's old hat every time he passed it, hanging by the door. His terrible singing voice that he unleashed anyway when he thought she couldn't hear. His surprising skill at baking bread learned from his mother. His nightmares sometimes. She heard him cry out once from the other room. And the way he never mentioned them in the morning, just worked a little harder as if trying to outrun whatever darkness haunted his sleep. She learned his kindness. The way he always made sure she ate enough, rested enough, didn't push herself too hard. The way he praised her efforts even when they resulted in burned dinners or backwards planted seeds. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, asking thoughtful questions and remembering details days later. And slowly, carefully, Lillian felt something growing in her chest. Not love, not yet. It was too soon for that, despite what romantic novels suggested. But affection, certainly. Trust, definitely. A tentative happiness that felt fragile and precious and worth protecting. Father Brennan returned on a Wednesday, and Samuel and Lillian met with him again. The priest studied them both carefully before asking, "Well, are you ready?" Lillian looked at Samuel, at his hopeful face and gentle eyes, at the calloused hands that had held hers so carefully. She thought about the ranch with its mountain views and the house that was beginning to feel like home. She thought about the garden waiting to bloom and the community that had welcomed her and the life she could build here if she was brave enough to try. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Samuel's hand found hers, squeezed gently. "So am I." Father Brennan smiled. "Then let's talk about a wedding." They planned it for Saturday, just 4 days away. A simple ceremony in the church, with the whole town invited because that's how things were done here. Mrs. Harper and Mrs. Johnson immediately took charge of preparations, insisting on making it special despite the short notice. Mrs. Chen offered to tailor Margaret Harper's blue dress into a proper wedding gown. Doc Miller's wife began organizing food for the reception. Lillian let them fuss, grateful for the kindness, the acceptance, the sense that she was joining something rather than just running away. And Samuel glowed with quiet happiness, his usual seriousness replaced with an almost boyish excitement that made her heart tender. The night before the wedding, Lillian stood at her window in Mrs. Harper's boarding house, looking out at the mountains painted silver by moonlight. Tomorrow, she would marry Samuel Reed. Tomorrow, she would become his wife, his partner, his family. Tomorrow, her new life would truly begin. She thought about the woman who'd frozen in that stagecoach 3 weeks ago, too terrified to step into her future. That woman seemed impossibly distant now, not gone, but transformed. Refined by choice and courage, and the patience of a good man who'd been willing to wait while she found her strength. A knock came at her door. Mrs. Harper entered without waiting for permission, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I wanted you to have this before tomorrow," she said, unfolding the cloth to reveal a beautiful quilt, intricate patchwork in blues and golds, each piece carefully stitched. "Margaret made this the year before she died. I've been saving it, but I think she'd want you to have it. For your marriage bed, for warmth on cold nights." Lillian's vision blurred with tears. "Mrs. Harper, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be happy. Say you'll make Samuel happy. Say you'll build a good life in this valley we all call home." The older woman pressed the quilt into Lillian's hands. "And say you'll come visit me sometimes, because I've gotten used to having you here." "I promise," Lillian whispered. "All of it. I promise." When Mrs. Harper left, Lillian spread the quilt across her bed and traced the careful stitches, each one a small act of love from a woman she'd never met. She thought about the life Margaret Harper must have lived, about the dreams she'd had, about the death that came too soon. And she thought about the life she, Lillian Moore, soon to be Lillian Reed, was about to begin. Sleep came late, but when it came, she dreamed of gardens in bloom and a hand reaching out to hold hers steady. Morning arrived with sunlight so bright it seemed to announce something momentous. Lillian woke before dawn, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and lingering nerves that she suspected every bride felt on her wedding day. The house was still quiet, the other boarders not yet stirring, but she could hear Mrs. Harper moving around downstairs, already preparing for the day's events. Lillian rose and dressed in her everyday clothes, knowing the wedding dress would come later. She stood at the window, watching Dust Valley wake up. Shopkeepers opening their doors, a few early risers heading to the bakery, the mountains standing eternal watch over it all. Somewhere out there, Samuel was probably already awake too, probably doing morning chores despite it being his wedding day because ranchers didn't get days off. Not really. The thought made her smile. That was who he was. Steady, reliable, a man who understood that life continued regardless of celebrations. She was marrying someone real, someone solid. Not a fairy tale prince, but a flesh and blood man with calloused hands and morning gruffness and a heart that had been brave enough to hope again after loss. Mrs. Harper appeared in the doorway with a breakfast tray. "I thought you might be too nervous to eat with the others. Besides, we need to start getting you ready soon. Mrs. Chen is bringing the dress at 8, and Mrs. Johnson will be here to help with your hair." "You've all been so kind," Lillian said, accepting the tray even though her stomach was too tight for food. "I don't know how to thank you." "Be happy. That's thanks enough." Mrs. Harper sat on the edge of the bed, her expression growing serious. "I want to tell you something, dear. Marriage isn't easy. Even the good ones take work. There'll be days when you wonder why you did this, days when the isolation feels crushing, days when you and Samuel will disagree about something and you'll both be too stubborn to back down first." Lillian's hands stilled on her teacup. "You're not exactly filling me with confidence. I'm filling you with truth. Because you need to know that those hard days don't mean you made a mistake. They just mean you're human, both of you." Mrs. Harper patted Lillian's hand. "My husband and I had 32 years together before he passed. Some of those years were wonderful. Some were so hard I didn't think we'd make it. But we did, because we remembered why we chose each other in the first place. We remembered that love isn't just a feeling, it's a decision you make every single day." "Did you love him, right from the start?" Mrs. Harper's smile turned wistful. "No, I married him for practical reasons, much like you're doing. He needed a wife. I needed security. But somewhere along the way, practical became precious. The man I married because I had no better option became the man I couldn't imagine living without." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "That's what I'm wishing for you and Samuel, that practical becomes precious, that duty becomes devotion, that the choice you're making today becomes the best decision of your life." The morning passed in a flurry of preparation. Mrs. Chen arrived with the altered dress, which had been transformed from a simple blue cotton into something truly beautiful. She'd added lace at the cuffs and neckline, taken in the waist to emphasize Lillian's figure, and somehow made the tiny embroidered flowers seem more prominent. When Lillian put it on, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. Mrs. Johnson arrived with her daughters, who squealed with delight at playing ladies' maids. They brushed and arranged Lillian's hair into an elegant style, weaving in small white flowers that Emma Johnson had gathered that morning. The younger girls danced around, chattering about the wedding and the reception and whether there would be cake. "You look like a princess," 5-year-old Lucy Johnson announced with the absolute certainty of childhood. "I feel like an imposter," Lillian admitted quietly to Mrs. Johnson while the girls were distracted with ribbons. "Every bride feels that way. Like she's playing dress-up, pretending to be someone she's not quite ready to be." Mrs. Johnson adjusted a flower in Lillian's hair. "But here's the secret. You grow into it. The woman you are today will marry Samuel, and then day by day, year by year, you'll become the woman who was always meant to be his wife. You'll see." At 10 o'clock, they made their way to the church. The entire town seemed to have turned out, packing the small building until people stood along the walls and sat on the floor. Lillian's hands trembled as she stood in the small anteroom, waiting for her cue to enter. Mrs. Harper stood beside her, having offered to walk her down the aisle since Lillian had no family to perform the duty. "Last chance to run," Mrs. Harper whispered with a small smile. "I'm not running. Not anymore." The door opened and Lillian could see inside the church. Flowers decorated every surface, wildflowers mostly, gathered by willing hands from the surrounding meadows. Candles provided soft light despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. And at the front, waiting beside Father Brennan in his simple vestments, stood Samuel. He'd dressed in his finest clothes, a dark suit that looked new, a crisp white shirt, a string tie carefully knotted. His hair was neatly combed, his face cleanly shaved, but what caught Lillian's attention was his expression. He looked nervous and hopeful, and absolutely certain all at once. his eyes finding hers across the crowded room with an intensity that made her breath catch. The musician, Mr. Peterson from the Mercantile, playing a battered violin, began a simple melody. Mrs. Harper squeezed Lillian's arm, and together they began the walk down the aisle. It felt both endless and instantaneous. Lillian was aware of faces turning toward her, of whispers and smiles, of children craning to see. But mostly she was aware of Samuel, of the way his expression shifted from nervousness to wonder as she approached, of the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if he had to physically restrain himself from reaching for her. When they reached the front, Mrs. Harper placed Lillian's hand in Samuel's with a meaningful look at them both. His palm was warm, slightly damp with nervous sweat, and his fingers closed around hers with gentle firmness. They turned together to face Father Brennan, and the ceremony began. Father Brennan spoke about marriage, not with flowery romance, but with honest assessment of what they were undertaking. He talked about partnership and patience, about choosing love even when feelings faltered, about the sacred responsibility of caring for another soul. He asked them to make their vows not just to each other, but before God and this community, witnesses who would help hold them accountable when times got hard. Samuel Reed, Father Brennan said, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Samuel's voice was steady, clear, carrying to every corner of the church. "I do." Lillian Moore, "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" This was it. The moment of final commitment, the point of no return. Lillian looked into Samuel's face, saw the hope and fear and trust there, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just practicality anymore. This wasn't just escape from Boston, or security, or convenience. This was choosing Samuel specifically, this patient, kind, steady man who'd given her time to find her courage. This was choosing hope over fear, possibility over safety, building over running. "I do," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. Samuel produced a ring, his mother's, as he'd mentioned in one of his early letters, a simple gold band that had been cleaned and polished until it gleamed. His hands shook slightly as he slid it onto Lillian's finger, and she heard his breath catch when it settled into place. She had no ring for him. They hadn't had time to arrange it, but he didn't seem to mind. He was staring at her hand, at the ring that marked her as his, with an expression of such profound gratitude that Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. "By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Colorado," Father Brennan announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride." Samuel's hands came up to cup Lillian's face, his touch reverent and careful. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she didn't want. She met him halfway, and their lips touched in a kiss that was sweet and chaste and full of promise. The church erupted in applause and cheers, but Lillian barely heard it. She was too focused on the feeling of Samuel's hands on her face, the warmth of his lips, the sense of something monumental clicking into place. When they pulled apart, Samuel was smiling, truly smiling, the kind of expression that transformed his entire face. "Hello, Mrs. Reed," he whispered. "Hello, husband," she whispered back, testing out the word and finding it fit. The reception was held at the town hall, the same place where they danced just weeks ago. But today it was decorated with even more flowers, and the food tables groaned under the weight of dishes the entire community had contributed. Someone had made a cake, a simple 3-layer affair with white frosting and fresh flowers on top, and when Lillian and Samuel cut it together, his hand over hers on the knife, she felt the symbolism of it. Working together, supporting each other, building something sweet from simple ingredients. They ate and danced and accepted congratulations from what felt like hundreds of people. Doc Miller gave them a basket of medical supplies and instructions for handling common ailments. The Chen family presented them with beautiful linens for their home. The Johnsons gave them preserves and jams that Mrs. Johnson had put up last summer. Even Sarah Michaels approached, though her congratulations were stiff and her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you'll be very happy," Sarah said, the words correct, but the tone suggesting she hoped for the opposite. "Thank you," Lillian replied with genuine warmth, refusing to let Sarah's bitterness touch her joy. "We'll do our best." As the afternoon wore on, people began leaving, ranch families who had long drives home, townspeople who had shops to tend. Samuel and Lillian stood by the door, thanking each person as they departed, until finally only Mrs. Harper and a few others remained to help clean up. "Go on," Mrs. Harper urged, shooing them away. "We'll handle this. You two should head to the ranch before it gets too late. Start your new life." Samuel looked at Lillian, a question in his eyes. She nodded, suddenly feeling shy despite having spent weeks preparing for this moment. They collected their things, her trunk had already been loaded on Samuel's wagon that morning, and made their way outside into the late afternoon sun. The ride to the ranch was quieter than any they'd taken before. Samuel drove with one hand, his other finding Lillian's and holding it between them on the wagon seat. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable, companionable. They were both absorbing what had happened, the enormity of the change they'd just enacted. When the ranch came into view, Lillian felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite name. This was home now. Not Mrs. Harper's boarding house, not the hotel, but this place. These buildings, this land, this life. She would wake here every morning, would learn every inch of this property, would grow old here if fate was kind. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and turned to her. "There's a tradition," he said, his voice a little rough, "about carrying the bride over the threshold. I know it might seem silly, but I'd like to do it if you're willing." "I'm willing," Lillian said, and found she meant it. This wasn't silly, this was ritual, marking the transition from one life to another. Samuel climbed down, then came around to help her from the wagon. But instead of just helping her down, he lifted her into his arms with surprising ease. Lillian gasped and instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart against her side. He carried her up the porch steps, those same steps she'd climbed several times now, but never like this, and paused at the door. "Welcome home, Lillian Reed," he said softly. Then he pushed open the door and carried her across the threshold into their home. The house had been transformed. Lillian noticed it immediately. Flowers and vases on every surface, candles waiting to be lit, and the scent of fresh baking. On the table sat a meal clearly prepared that morning and left for them to find: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables, even a small cake. A note in Mrs. Johnson's handwriting read simply, "Congratulations, eat well." Samuel set Lillian down carefully, and they stood together in the main room of the house that was now theirs. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold. Outside, birds called to each other as they settled for the evening. Rusty the cat appeared from somewhere, winding around their legs in welcome. "Are you hungry?" Samuel asked, seeming suddenly uncertain now that they were alone. "We could eat, or I could show you where I put your things, or we could—" "Samuel," Lillian interrupted gently. She reached up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble already growing back. "Thank you." "For what?" "For waiting, for being patient, for giving me time to choose you instead of forcing me to accept you." Her thumb traced his cheekbone. "For being exactly who you promised you'd be in those letters." Samuel's hands came to rest on her waist, light and careful. "I meant everything I wrote, every word, and I'll keep meaning it, every day we have together." He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "I'm nervous. About tonight. About getting this right. I don't want to rush you or frighten you or—" Lillian stopped his words with a kiss, more confident than the one in the church. When she pulled back, she saw surprise and pleasure in his eyes. "We'll figure it out together. One step at a time, just like everything else." They ate the meal Mrs. Johnson had left, feeding each other bites of cake and laughing at their own awkwardness. Samuel told stories about growing up in this house, about learning to cook at that very stove, about the time he'd accidentally set the curtains on fire, trying to impress his mother with his candle-lighting skills. Lillian shared more about her childhood in Boston, about her parents and the sister she'd lost, about the books she'd read, and the dreams she'd had before life had gotten complicated. As darkness fell, Samuel lit candles throughout the house, creating a warm glow that pushed back the night. He showed Lillian where he'd arranged her things in the bedroom, her clothes in the wardrobe, her books on a shelf he'd built specially, her personal items on the bureau. Margaret Harper's quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, a beautiful addition to the room. "I know we talked about you taking the small room," Samuel said, standing in the doorway as if afraid to crowd her. "That offer still stands if you want privacy. I can sleep on the sofa, or—" "Stay," Lillian said. So she was frightened she'd be lying if she claimed otherwise, but she was also certain. "I want you to stay." What happened next was gentle and awkward and tender all at once. Samuel was careful with her, checking constantly that she was all right, that he wasn't hurting her, that she wanted to continue. And Lillian discovered that intimacy wasn't the terrifying ordeal she'd feared based on whispered warnings from other women. It was strange, yes, and vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it was also sweet and funny and surprisingly natural when shared with someone who cared about her comfort as much as his own pleasure. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, Samuel's arms around her and Lillian's head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to its normal rhythm. Through the window, she could see stars, thousands of them, a display that would never stop amazing her after years of Boston's light-dimmed skies. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, his voice rumbling in his chest. "That I'm happy. Genuinely happy. Maybe for the first time in years." Lillian traced idle patterns on his skin. "That I was so scared stepping off that stagecoach, and now I can't imagine having stayed on it." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "I was scared too. Scared you'd take one look at me and run. Scared I'd built up something in my letters that couldn't match reality. Scared I'd lost my chance at this kind of happiness when my parents died." "You haven't lost it. We haven't lost it." Lillian pressed a kiss to his chest. "We're just beginning." They fell asleep tangled together, exhausted from the day's emotions and the newness of everything. When Lillian woke in the night, momentarily disoriented, Samuel's arm instinctively pulled her closer even in sleep, and she relaxed back against him, marveling at how quickly the strange had become familiar. The days that followed established a rhythm. Samuel taught Lillian the routines of ranch life, the early morning check on the animals, the constant maintenance that kept everything running, the seasonal work of ranching. She proved surprisingly capable, her fear of cattle gradually giving way to a wary respect as she learned to read their behavior. She could milk the cow without assistance now, collect eggs with confidence, even help with basic veterinary care when Samuel showed her how. The garden became her domain, as Samuel had promised. She spent hours there, clearing the last of the weeds, enriching the soil, planning what would be planted come spring. Mrs. Johnson donated seeds and advice, teaching Lillian which vegetables thrived in Colorado's climate and which were more trouble than they were worth. By the time winter arrived, Lillian had put up enough preserves to fill a whole shelf in the pantry, tangible proof that she could be useful here, that she could contribute to their survival. She learned to cook, too, with varying degrees of success. Some meals were triumphs that Samuel praised enthusiastically. Others were disasters that they choked down while trying not to laugh. Samuel never complained, even when she burned the biscuits so badly they could have been used as ammunition. Instead, he taught her his mother's recipes, standing behind her at the stove, guiding her hands, turning cooking lessons into moments of intimacy that had nothing to do with food. The isolation that everyone had warned about did prove challenging at times. There were days when Samuel was out on the range from dawn until after dark, and Lillian was alone with only the animals for company. On those days, she read or worked in the garden or wrote letters to Mrs. Harper and the friends she was slowly making in town. But she discovered that solitude wasn't the same as loneliness when you knew someone was coming home to you at day's end. They rode into town together once a week, attending church on Sundays and staying for the social hour afterward. Lillian slowly became part of the community, not just Samuel Reed's wife, but Lillian Reed in her own right. She helped Mrs. Chen organize a lending library. She assisted Miss Peters with teaching the ranch children who came irregularly to school. She joined Mrs. Johnson's quilting circle, learning a skill she'd never had time for in Boston. And slowly, gradually, practical did become precious. The man she'd married out of desperation became the man she couldn't imagine living without. She learned the way his face softened when he looked at her, the little gifts he left for her, a pretty rock from the creek, wildflowers on her pillow, a book he'd bought on one of his rare trips to Denver. She learned that he had nightmares about his parents' deaths, and she learned to wake him gently and hold him until the memories faded. She learned that he sang terribly, but with great enthusiasm when he thought she couldn't hear, that he talked to the cattle as if they were confidants, that he had a surprisingly dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable. And Samuel learned her. He learned that she needed quiet mornings with coffee before conversation, that she had a temper when pushed too far but forgave quickly, that she sometimes cried for no reason she could explain and just needed to be held. He learned that her hands were skilled with accounts and that she had a head for business that helped improve his ranch management. He learned that she was braver than she believed, stronger than she looked, and more essential to his happiness than he'd dared hope. Winter came, bringing snow that transformed the ranch into something from a fairy tale. They spent long evenings by the fire, Samuel reading aloud from books while Lillian worked on her quilting, both of them content in companionable silence broken only by the crackle of flames and occasional comments on the story. On Christmas, Samuel gave her a rocking chair he'd built himself, smooth and beautiful, perfect for sitting on the porch come spring. Lillian gave him a shirt she'd sewn, the stitching imperfect but made with care. They spent the day quietly, just the two of them, cooking a special meal and talking about the year past and the years to come. "I want to tell you something," Samuel said as they sat by the fire that night. "Something I've been feeling but wasn't sure how to say." Lillian set aside her quilting, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" "I love you." The words were simple, direct, characteristically Samuel. "Not just care about you or appreciate you, though I do both those things. I mean, I'm in love with you, Lillian, really, truly in love. And I know we said this was practical, that we didn't expect romance, but somewhere along the way it became that anyway, at least for me." Lillian felt her eyes fill with tears, happy tears, the kind she'd cried more in the past 6 months than in her entire life before. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid I'd break some unspoken rule about practical marriages." Samuel laughed, the sound warm and free. "To hell with rules, let's make our own." He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that still surprised her sometimes, still made her feel chosen and cherished. "Let's be impractical and romantic and completely devoted to each other." "Yes," Lillian agreed, kissing him back. "Let's be all of those things." Spring arrived, bringing with it a flurry of activity. The garden burst into life under Lillian's careful tending. The cattle calved successfully, adding to their herd. Samuel and Mr. Johnson helped each other with various projects, strengthening the bond between neighboring ranches. And one morning in early April, Lillian woke feeling queasy in a way that had nothing to do with illness. She waited another week to be sure, then told Samuel over breakfast, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment he was frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Then he set it down carefully and came around the table to pull her into his arms. "A baby?" His voice was thick with emotion. "We're going to have a baby?" "In about 7 months, if Doc Miller's calculations are right." Samuel held her at arm's length, his eyes searching her face. "Are you happy? Scared? Both?" "Both," Lillian admitted. "Terrified, actually, but also happier than I knew I could be." "Me too. All of it." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "A baby, our baby, a family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, despite Lillian's fears. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Harper became constant sources of advice and support, preparing her for what to expect. Samuel hovered protectively, trying to prevent her from doing any work he deemed too strenuous, which led to their first real argument when Lillian insisted she was pregnant, not fragile. "I'm not made of glass," she'd snapped, frustrated by his well-meaning interference. "I can still collect eggs and work in the garden. Women have been having babies and doing work for all of human history." "But you're my wife," Samuel had countered, equally frustrated. "And I'll be damned if I let you hurt yourself or the baby because I wasn't careful enough." They'd fought, really fought, both stubborn and convinced of their rightness. It ended with Lillian in tears and Samuel looking stricken, neither of them sure how to bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between them. But that night, lying in bed with space between them, both too proud to apologize first, Samuel had reached out to find her hand in the darkness. "I'm sorry," he'd said quietly. "I'm not trying to control you. I'm just scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of something going wrong. Scared I won't know how to protect you both." Lillian had turned to him then, closing the space between them. "I'm scared too. But we can't let fear make us forget how to be partners. We work together, remember? We figure things out together." "Together," Samuel had agreed, and they'd held each other until the hurt faded and the closeness returned. That fight taught them both something important. That disagreements didn't mean failure. That anger didn't erase love. That you could weather storms as long as you remembered you were on the same side. The baby came in November, on a day when early snow fell softly outside the windows. Mrs. Johnson and Doc Miller attended the birth, while Samuel paced holes in the porch floor, too nervous to stay inside but too devoted to go far. When Doc Miller finally emerged to tell him he had a daughter, Samuel nearly fell down the steps in his haste to get inside. Lillian lay exhausted in their bed, cradling a tiny bundle against her chest. She looked up when Samuel entered, and her smile was radiant despite her fatigue. "Meet your daughter." Samuel approached as if the bed held something infinitely precious and fragile, which, in a way, it did. He sat carefully on the edge, staring at the impossibly small face peering out from the blankets. "She's perfect." "She has your eyes," Lillian observed. "And your stubborn chin, I think." "Poor thing." Samuel touched one tiny hand with his finger, marveling when it closed around him instinctively. "Hello, little one. I'm your papa." They named her Elizabeth, after Lillian's sister, with Rose as a middle name after Samuel's mother. Elizabeth Rose Reed entered the world with strong lungs and definite opinions, demanding attention and giving love in equal measure. The years passed in that way time has of accelerating once you're living a life that matters. Elizabeth grew from infant to toddler to little girl, running through the house that had once felt too quiet. Samuel built her a swing near the cottonwood trees by the creek, and Lillian sewed her dresses that she inevitably got dirty within hours. They taught her to love books and nature, to treat animals with respect, to understand the value of hard work. 2 years after Elizabeth, they had a son, Daniel Samuel Reed, who came into the world with less fuss than his sister, but no less love to greet him. The house that had once held only echoes of the past now rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. The ranch prospered. Samuel's careful management and Lillian's business sense combined to make their operation one of the most successful in the valley. They expanded gradually, buying neighboring land when it became available, improving their herd, building additional structures. But they never forgot what mattered most: each other, their children, the community that had welcomed them. On their 10th anniversaries, Samuel arrived home from town with a letter and a grin. "Remember how you once said you wanted to open a school for ranch families?" Lillian looked up from where she was helping Elizabeth with her arithmetic. "Of course. Why?" "The Territorial Education Board approved your proposal. They're offering funding to start a small school here in our valley, and they want you to run it." Lillian stared at him, torn between excitement and uncertainty. "Samuel, that would mean more work for you with me teaching. The children to manage alone sometimes. Are you sure you're all right with this?" "I'm more than all right. I'm proud." He pulled her into his arms right there in front of the children. "You've given me everything, Lillian. A family, a real home, happiness I didn't think I'd ever find again. Let me give you this dream." The school opened the following spring, a small structure built near the ranch house with help from the entire community. Lillian taught reading and writing and arithmetic to the children of ranch families who lived too far from town for regular education. It was hard work, adding to her already full days, but it was also deeply satisfying. She watched children learn to read, saw their faces light up with understanding, and knew she was making a difference in these young lives. The years continued to pass. Elizabeth grew into a serious young woman who loved books as much as her mother, and had her father's steady nature. Daniel became a skilled horseman who could gentle even the most difficult animals. They grew and changed, and sometimes Lillian looked at them and couldn't quite believe they'd come from her. These capable, confident children being raised so differently from how she'd been raised. One evening, as Samuel and Lillian sat on the porch in matching rocking chairs, Samuel had built a second one for her 40th birthday, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Elizabeth and Daniel playing by the creek with friends whose parents had come for dinner, Lillian found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, reaching over to take her hand just as he had thousands of times over the years. "About how the hardest step I ever took was off that stagecoach," Lillian said, echoing a thought she'd had years ago. "How terrified I was. How I almost didn't do it." Samuel raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles in that old-fashioned gesture he'd never abandoned. "And the best decision I ever made was not taking back my hand when you were too afraid to reach for it, waiting for you to find your courage. We've built something good, haven't we?" Lillian's voice was soft, contemplative. "Better than good. We've built a life, a real life full of all the messiness and beauty that comes with it." Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Every struggle, every hard day, every moment of uncertainty. All of it, if it meant ending up here with you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children and the mountains and the sky that seemed infinite in its possibility. The ranch spread out around them, their land, their home, their legacy. The garden Lillian had brought back from the dead flourished in ordered rows. The house rang with life and laughter. The future stretched ahead with the promise of grandchildren and continued growth and years of partnership still to come. Lillian thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, frightened, desperate, running from one bad situation without knowing if she was running toward something better. That woman seemed like a stranger now, or perhaps an old friend she'd outgrown. She'd become someone else in the years since, someone stronger, braver, more certain of her place in the world. But she hadn't done it alone. She'd done it with Samuel beside her, patient and steady, offering his hand and waiting for her to take it. She'd done it with the support of a community that had welcomed her. She'd done it one step at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston? Giving up city life for all of this?" Lillian turned to look at him, at his weathered face and gentle eyes, at the man who'd kept every promise he'd made in those careful letters. "Not for a single moment. This life, this place, you're everything I didn't know I was searching for." Samuel's smile was the same one he'd given her on their wedding day, full of wonder and gratitude and love. "You're my greatest gift, Lillian Reed. Everything good in my life traces back to the day you stepped off that stagecoach." As the sun completed its descent and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Samuel and Lillian remained on their porch, hands linked between their rocking chairs. Their children's laughter drifted up from the creek. The mountains stood eternal watch, and two people who'd started as strangers, brought together by desperate hope and practical necessity, sat together in the life they'd built, proof that courage and kindness and partnership could create something beautiful from the simplest of beginnings. The woman who'd been too afraid to step down had found her footing at last, and the man who'd been patient enough to wait had been rewarded with a lifetime of love. Together, they'd taken that first impossible step, and then another and another, until they'd walked themselves into a future neither could have imagined alone. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.